Nils Bakke had spent 3 months digging what every person in the street, Croix Valley, called a child's grave. But on the night the thermometer froze solid, that shallow pit of stone and earth became the only thing keeping his family's hearts beating. The autumn wind cut through the Croix Valley of Wisconsin in late November of 1888, with a cold, dry malice that seemed to carry the weight of the northern glaciers. It was a landscape defined by its harsh transitions, where the vibrant golds of the turning oak trees were stripped away in a single afternoon by gusts screaming off the river, leaving behind a gray, skeletal woodland. Every homesteader within 5 miles had spent their autumn days in a state of quiet panic, stacking their firewood piles to the eaves of their barns, checking the mud chinking between their spruce logs, and sealing their heavy wooden doors with old rags. They knew the unwritten rule of the territory. Winter here was not a season to be enjoyed, but a relentless adversary that tested the structural integrity of your home and the limits of your physical endurance. If you made a mistake in November, the territory made you pay for it in January, often with the loss of your livestock, your fingers, or your children. Nils Bakke was a man who understood this reality better than most, though he rarely spoke of it. He was a Norwegian immigrant with broad shoulders, quiet blue eyes, and hands that had been deeply scarred by years of hard labor in the shipyards of Bergen. He had brought his family to Wisconsin with the hope of carving a homestead out of the heavy clay soil, but his shipbuilding instincts had never left him. Where other men saw only timber and mud, Nils saw fluid dynamics, pressure gradients, and the silent, invisible movement of heat. He spent his evening walks observing the natural world, noting how the wild badgers burrowed deep beneath the frost line to escape the howling winds, and how the heavy glacial fieldstones along the riverbank held the warmth of the afternoon sun long after the twilight had faded into cold darkness. His wife, Karen, watched him with a mixture of quiet pride and unspoken anxiety. She was a practical woman who had left behind a comfortable life in Norway to follow Nils into the wilderness, but the previous winter had nearly broken her spirit. Their 7-year-old daughter, Elsa, was a fragile child with pale skin and golden hair who had spent the entire winter of 1887 fighting a severe, rattling lung fever. Karen could still remember the terrifying, hollow sound of Elsa's cough echoing through the dark cabin in the dead of night, a sound that made her heart seize with a primitive dread. They had huddled together in their drafty 14 by 18-foot spruce log cabin, burning through cord after cord of split oak, but the floorboards had remained so cold that a spilled bucket of water would turn to solid ice within minutes. The rising heat from the fireplace had escaped uselessly through the gaps in the pine roof boards, leaving the family to shiver beneath piles of heavy quilts, while the frost crawled up the log walls like frozen fingers. Nils knew that Elsa's lungs could not survive another winter in that poorly designed shelter, and as the first gray clouds of November began to gather on the horizon, he resolved to find a solution that did not rely on the brute force of an open fire. If you are finding value in these forgotten lessons of frontier resilience, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, where we share the practical wisdom of those who survive the coldest corners of the earth. The first true test of the season arrived in mid-October, bringing with it a sudden, biting freeze that caught the Croix settlement unprepared. Nils woke at 3 in the morning to a profound, heavy silence, the kind of quiet that only accompanies a rapid drop in temperature. Beside him, Karen was already awake, her body tense, as she stared toward the corner of the cabin where Elsa lay. From the darkness of the girl's small wooden cot came a familiar, terrifying sound, a dry, rattling cough that caught in her throat and left her gasping for breath. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a pile of dull orange coals, and the cold air of the cabin had become so dense that Nils could see the white plume of his own breath by the dim light of the embers. Nils threw back his blankets and knelt before the fireplace, blowing gently on the coals as he fed them thin strips of dry birch bark and split oak. The flames caught slowly, casting long dancing shadows across the cabin floor, but Nils could feel the immediate drafty movement of the air. As the fire grew hotter, it began to draw cold air inward through the minute gaps between the floorboards, creating a freezing current that swept across the room at ankle height. It was a basic law of physics that most pioneers ignored. A roaring fire acted as a powerful exhaust, pulling the heaviest, coldest air from the outside into the lowest levels of the cabin. While the space directly in front of the hearth became uncomfortably hot, the corners of the room remained freezing, and the floorboards stayed cold enough to numb a man's feet through his thick wool socks. Nils returned to his bed, but he did not sleep. He lay awake, listening to the rhythmic, labored breathing of his daughter and the howling of the wind outside, his mind working through the mechanical limitations of their home. He realized that the traditional log cabin, for all its rugged beauty, was a deeply flawed thermodynamic structure. It was a drafty box that fought a constant, losing battle against the atmosphere. You could split wood until your hands bled, and you could stack it neat and tight under every overhang. But when the Arctic wind came screaming down from Canada, it would strip the heat directly from the log walls through convective cooling faster than any open fireplace could replace it. The family was spending their lives cutting down forests just to heat the open sky above their roof, while their child lay shivering on a floor that remained locked in a perpetual freeze. As the pale light of dawn began to filter through the oiled paper windows, Nils stood up and walked to the center of the cabin, staring down at the pine floorboards. He knew he could not afford to build a larger, more elaborate home, and he knew he could not stop the wind from blowing. But he also knew that the earth beneath his feet held a secret that the builders of his era had completely discarded. He made a quiet vow to Karen and to his sleeping daughter. He would build a sanctuary where the wind could not reach them, a place where the temperature remained steady and gentle, independent of the winter's rage. He would not spend another season begging in drafty fireplace to keep his daughter alive. He would use the earth itself as a shield, burying their bed beneath the frost line where the cold of the northern plains could never penetrate. When the ground finally thawed in the spring of 1890, Nils Bakke did not begin plowing his fields or clearing more timber for crops. Instead, he took his heavy iron spade, his pickaxe, and a pair of sturdy oak buckets, and he began to dig. He chose a spot directly beneath the north corner of his cabin, where their sleeping area had been. He carefully pried up the heavy pine floorboards, exposing the dark, damp Wisconsin soil beneath, and he drove his spade into the earth with a slow, rhythmic determination. The work was physically punishing in a way that clearing timber could never match. After the first 2 feet of loose topsoil had been removed, Nils hit a dense, heavy layer of gray clay that had been compressed by centuries of geological pressure. The clay clung to his spade, like wet dough, requiring him to pry it free with his boot after every single stroke. His shoulders ached, his lower back throbbed with a dull, persistent heat, and his hands quickly became covered in deep, raw blisters that popped and filled with dirt. Yet, he did not slow his pace. Every bucket of heavy clay he hauled up the wooden ramp was driven by the memory of Elsa's dry, rattling cough. He knew that the frost line in this part of Wisconsin regularly went down 4 feet, and to reach the zone of true thermal stability, he had to go deeper. He had to go 7 feet down, into the dense, gravelly glacial, till that had remained undisturbed since the ice sheets retreated 10,000 years earlier. By the end of the first week, Nils was working in a deep, rectangular pit that sat silent and cool beneath his cabin. The air down there was different from the air on the surface. It was heavy, damp, and smelled of ancient minerals and cold stone. From the county road, neighbors riding past in their wagons began to notice the massive pile of gray clay accumulating outside the Bakke cabin. They would stop their horses, peer through the open door, and watch Nils's broad shoulders disappear beneath the level of his floorboards. The laughter started almost immediately. To the practical, hard-working homesteaders of the street, Croix Valley, a man digging a massive hole inside his own home during the planting season, was a spectacle of absolute madness. They called the excavation Bakke's grave, or Nils' folly, joking that the Norwegian had finally cracked under the isolation of the frontier. They would stand at the edge of his property, shaking their heads as Nils hauled up another bucket of clay, shouting jokes about whether he was planning to winter his family with the gophers. But Nils remained silent. He would look up from the dark pit, wipe the sweat and gray clay from his forehead with a scarred hand, nod politely to his neighbors, and return to his spade. He was not digging a grave. He was excavating a future for his family, and he knew that the earth would soon deliver a verdict that none of them could laugh away. The criticism became formal and public when Ezra Ward rode onto the Bakke property in late June. Ezra was a master carpenter from Maine who had lived in the territory for 15 years, and he had built nearly half the log cabins in the valley. He was a man with a booming voice, a practical mind, and a deep, unshakable belief in the traditional methods of his ancestors. He did not like innovation, and he did not like immigrants who tried to tell him there was a better way to build. Ezra walked into the Bakke cabin without knocking, stood at the edge of the pit, and looked down at Nils with an expression of quiet, professional disgust. He ran his hand along the spruce logs of the cabin walls, shook his head, and pointed a finger down at the dark excavation. He told Nils that he was undermining the structural safety of his own home, and that the first heavy rain of autumn would turn the soil beneath his logs to mud, causing the entire north wall of his cabin to sag and collapse into his hole. He warned him that the earth was a conductor of dampness, and that sleeping in a hole would fill his family's lungs with mold and moisture, guaranteeing that Elsa would not survive to see another spring. Ezra's voice was loud, carrying easily through the open windows to the neighbors who had gathered in the yard to watch the confrontation. The social pressure on the Bakke family grew heavier after Ezra's visit. Karen found herself avoided at the trading post, where the other women would whisper in hushed, pitying tones about the strange Norwegian who had lost his mind. The local doctor, a well-meaning man who had trained in Chicago, stopped by the cabin to express his concerns, warning Karen that damp, stagnant air was the primary cause of lung rot and consumption. He urged her to make Nils fill the hole and build a proper, raised sleeping loft where the air could circulate. Karen returned to the cabin that evening with a heavy heart, her hands trembling as she set a pot of cornmeal on the hearth. She looked at Nils, who was sitting at the wooden table, his face exhausted but his eyes clear and calm. She asked him if they were doing the right thing, if Ezra's warnings of structural collapse and dampness were true. Nils stood up, walked to her, and took her hands in his. He did not offer a long, defensive argument. He simply led her to the trapdoor, pointed down into the cool, silent chamber, and asked her to feel the air. It was cool, yes, but it was dry, and the heavy clay walls had already begun to harden like brick in the summer heat. Nils told her that the traditional cabins were the real danger, boxes of wood that let the wind strip their life away. He asked her to trust his hands and the wisdom of the earth, and Karen, looking into his eyes, found the strength to shut out the whispers of the valley. By late July, the excavation was complete, and Nils began the second, more grueling phase of his project, building the thermal battery. He took his wooden wagon down to the riverbank every morning, selecting glacial fieldstones that had been polished smooth by thousands of years of flowing water. He chose stones that were dense, heavy, and free of cracks, sandstones that would release heat slowly, and granites that would hold their temperature for hours. He hauled over 4,500 pounds of these stones back to his cabin, one wagon load at a time, his horse straining against the heavy load. Nils began stacking the stones along the clay walls of the pit, creating a continuous mortared lining that resembled the interior of an ancient stone well. He mixed his mortar with a structured blend of local clay, fine river sand, and lime, troweling it between the rocks with a precision that amazed even Karen. The walls took shape slowly, rising from the gravel floor to a height of 7 feet, where they met the heavy timber joists of the cabin floor. Nils made sure that every stone was tightly fitted against its neighbor, leaving no air pockets behind that could trap moisture or allow cold drafts to penetrate from the surrounding earth. The resulting masonry was beautiful in its rugged, functional simplicity, a solid, unyielding fortress of stone buried deep within the earth. The ceiling of the chamber required an orderly, highly engineered approach to support the weight of the cabin floor and the family's daily movements above. Nils used 4 massive spruce beams, 8 inches thick, which he salvaged from an old abandoned claim cabin. He notched these beams directly into the stone walls, transferring the structural load to the bedrock below rather than relying on the clay earth. Between the beams, he laid tight-fitted split planks of oak, creating a solid wooden ceiling. Above these planks, Nils packed a 10-inch layer of dry wood shavings and flax straw, creating an airtight, highly insulated thermal break. This barrier ensured that no heat from the chamber could escape upward through the floorboards, and no cold drafts from the drafty cabin could sink downward into their sleeping space. It was a separation of two distinct thermal zones: the volatile, windswept world of the log cabin above, and the stable, silent sanctuary of the stone chamber below. Nils spent his evenings running his hands along the completed stonework, checking for the slightest sign of dampness or movement, but the structure remained as solid and dry as a mountain cave. If you believe that traditional building methods like this are worth preserving, please hit that subscribe button to join our channel, where we continue to explore the forgotten technologies of the frontier. To address the doctor's concerns about stagnant air and moisture, Nils engineered a passive air circulation system that utilized the natural laws of convection. He spent 3 days in the woods, searching for straight, solid willow branches that had been hollowed out by wood-boring insects or rot. He selected 2 branches, 5 inches in diameter, and cleared their interiors with a long iron rod until they formed smooth, hollow tubes. Nils installed these wooden pipes through the stone walls of the chamber, running them up through the cabin floorboards. The first pipe, the cold air intake, was positioned at the lowest point of the stone chamber, near the gravel floor, and emerged in the far corner of the cabin where the coldest drafts gathered. The second pipe, the warm air return, was installed at the highest point of the stone chamber's ceiling, directly beneath the insulated floorboards, and emerged near the warmth of the fireplace. This created a natural convective loop, a thermosiphon. As the heavy, cold draft air from the cabin floor sank down through the intake pipe into the cellar, it was warmed by the Earth's natural geothermal temperature of 47 degrees Fahrenheit. As the air warmed, its density decreased, causing it to rise naturally back up into the cabin through the return pipe, tempered and fresh. It was a continuous, silent cycle that required no fans, no electricity, and no fuel. It tempered the freezing drafts of the cabin floorboards from below, while ensuring that the sleeping chamber remained constantly ventilated with clean, oxygen-rich air. Nils completed the interior of the chamber by laying flat river stones across the gravel floor, covering them with thick layers of dry straw and heavy sheepskins Karen had sewn together. He built a low, sturdy bed frame of split pine, placing it in the center of the chamber, directly beneath the warm air return. He cut a thick, insulated wood hatch in the cabin floor, hanging it on heavy iron hinges and sealing the edges with wool felt. When closed, the trapdoor was nearly invisible, fitting flush with the pine floorboards. From the main cabin, there was no sign of the underground space, except for the 2 small, round wooden registers near the walls. Nils climbed down the ladder, pulled the trapdoor shut, and lay in the darkness. The air was cool, fresh, and completely silent. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of Karin's footsteps above, but the wind had disappeared. The temperature in the chamber sat at a steady 51 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring only a single wool blanket for comfort. Nils smiled in the dark, knowing his family was ready for whatever the Wisconsin winter had in store. The winter of 1888 to 1889 would be remembered in the Street Croix Valley as the year of the Great White Death. The first months of the season were typical, bringing moderate snow and manageable cold. But in late January, the barometer began a rapid, terrifying drop. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple-gray, and the wind, which had been blowing gently from the south, suddenly shifted to the northwest, bringing with it an Alberta Clipper of unprecedented force. By noon on January 11th, the blizzard was in full rage. The wind howled at a sustained 40 miles per hour, with gusts that shook the heavy logs of the cabins and tore the cedar shakes from their roofs. The snow fell not in flakes, but in fine horizontal needles of ice that penetrated every crack in the timber, chinking, piling, in small, white drifts on kitchen tables and windowsills. The temperature plummeted with a speed that made people gasping for breath. 0 at noon, 10 below by sunset, and 27 degrees below zero by midnight. Across the valley, families were caught in a desperate, freezing struggle. In Ezra Ward's well-built cabin, The master carpenter and his wife were feeding their massive fireplace every 40 minutes, burning through 55 pounds of split oak in a single night. The fire roared, but the intense wind created a low-pressure draft that pulled freezing air through the floorboards, keeping the floor temperature at an icy 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Ezra's children slept in their winter coats, huddled beneath 5 layers of heavy wool blankets, their breath freezing into solid sheets of ice on their pillows. Nils Bakke watched the storm from his cabin window, waiting until the cold had reached its peak. He added 3 large oak logs to his fireplace, banking the coals with ash so they would smolder slowly and keep the cabin above freezing. Then, he lifted the heavy wooden trapdoor in the corner of the room. He guided Karen down the ladder, carrying the sleeping Elsa in his arms, and pulled the insulated door shut above them, securing the iron latch. The transition was immediate and profound. The howling of the wind, which had been a deafening, exhausting roar above, was instantly reduced to a faint, rhythmic vibration that felt more like the purr of a sleeping animal than a storm. The air in the stone chamber was completely still, fresh, and smelled of dry clay and clean river stones. There were no drafts, no cold currents sweeping across the floor, no frost forming on the walls. Nils laid Elsa on the sheepskin bed, tucking her in with a single wool blanket. The mercury thermometer he had hung from the timber beam read a steady 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 42 degrees warmer than the cabin floor above them, and 83 degrees warmer than the frozen wilderness outside. Nils sat at the edge of the bed, holding Karen's hand in the warm darkness, and they slept in peace. By 4 in the morning, the fire in the cabin above had burned down to a pile of gray ashes, its heat long since lost to the screaming northwest wind. The temperature in the main living space plummeted to a freezing 14 degrees. Ice formed in the water bucket near the hearth, and frost crawled up the spruce logs like white moss. If Nils and his family had been sleeping above ground, they would have been forced to wake every 2 hours, shivering and exhausted, to reload the fire and fight the drafty cold that swept across their bed. But 6 feet below, in the silent, stone-lined chamber, the environment remained entirely unaffected by the freeze above. The 4,500 pounds of sandstone and river rocks had spent the autumn months absorbing the Earth's steady geothermal warmth and the residual heat from the cabin floor. Now, they acted as a powerful thermal battery, releasing that stored energy back into the small, insulated space at a slow, predictable rate. The air entering through the sumac intakes was warmed by the stone walls before it reached the bed, keeping the chamber at a gentle, comfortable temperature. Corinne woke in the early darkness, her body expecting the usual shivering transition of a winter morning. She reached her hand out from beneath the blanket, expecting to feel the biting chill of the air, but her skin touched only comfortable warmth. She sat up, looking around the dim chamber by the soft glow of the kerosene lamp Nils had left burning on a low stone ledge. Elsa lay beside her, her cheeks flushed with a healthy, natural pink, her breathing quiet, deep, and completely free of the dry, rattling cough that had haunted her for 2 years. The realization hit Corinne with an intensity that brought tears to her eyes. She looked at Nils, who was watching her with a quiet, tired smile, and she understood what he had built. He had not just dug a hole, he had built a fortress of love that the Wisconsin winter could never breach. He had removed his family from the struggle of the frontier, using the Earth's own ancient warmth to shelter them. The laughter of their neighbors, the warnings of Ezra Ward, the professional concerns of the doctor, they were all gone, swept away by the silent, undeniable reality of a 42-degree temperature difference. She reached out and held Nils close, her heart filled with a profound gratitude for the stubborn, quiet Norwegian who had refused to let his daughter freeze. The blizzard finally broke on the morning of January 14th, leaving behind a streaked Croix Valley that looked like an Arctic wasteland. The sun rose into a sky so clear and bright it hurt the eyes, its light reflecting off snowdrifts that reached the eaves of some cabins. The temperature outside remained at 22 degrees below zero, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath boots. Ezra Ward and 3 other neighbors struggled through chest-deep snow toward the Bakke property. They were exhausted, their faces pinched with cold, their hands stiff from days of splitting wood. They had seen no smoke from Nils's chimney since the previous evening, and they feared the worst. They expected to find the cabin frozen, the family dead in their beds from the cold that had nearly taken their own children. They walked into the cabin without knocking, their breath freezing in thick clouds inside the room. The cabin floor read 14 degrees, and the water bucket on the table was a solid block of ice. Nils opened the wooden trapdoor in the corner of the floor and climbed up the ladder, his face rested and his eyes bright. He greeted his neighbors politely, showing no sign of the cold that had left them shivering. Ezra stared at him, his mouth open in disbelief. "How are you alive?" he managed to ask, his voice hoarse from the smoke of his own fireplace. Nils pointed down into the opening. "Come see." Ezra Ward descended the ladder, his hand holding his own mercury thermometer. The moment his feet touched the stone floor, he stopped. The warm, dry air hit his face like stepping into an October afternoon. He held up his thermometer, watching the mercury column rise slowly, steadily, until it stopped at exactly 56 degrees 42 degrees warmer than the cabin floor above him. He walked around the stone walls, touching the warm sandstones, checking for the dampness he had predicted, but finding only dry, solid masonry. He looked at Elsa, who was sitting on the sheepskin bed, laughing as she played with a small wooden doll, her lungs clear and healthy. Ezra stood in the center of the chamber for a long time, looking down at his thermometer, and then he looked at Nils. "I have built cabins for 40 years, Ezra said quietly, his pride completely gone, "but I have never built anything as smart as this." "I was wrong, Nils. Completely wrong." The conversion of Ezra Ward was the turning point for the Street Croix settlement. The story of the basement bed that held 56 degrees during the worst Clipper in history spread through the valley like a warm wind. The neighbors who had laughed at Nils's excavation came back to apologize, their faces filled with humility and a desperate desire to learn his methods. They had realized that traditional progress building wood cabins with massive fires was a drafty illusion. Nils' victory was not one of pride, but of quiet inspiration. That spring, before the planting season began, Ezra Ward and Nils Bakke partnered to design earth-tempered sleeping chambers for families across the valley. Nils shared his measurements freely, showing them how to select dense river stones, how to mix clay-lime mortar, and how to construct the passive convective loops that kept the air fresh and dry. Before the first frost of 1,889, 19 families in Black River Falls had built variations of Nils' design, ensuring their children slept in comfort. Nils lived in his cabin for another 20 years, raising Elsa and 3 other children in that stone chamber, where winter was something that happened outside, not inside. The rattling cough never returned to Elsa's lungs, and she grew into a healthy, strong woman who would tell her own children about the stubborn father who dug into the earth to save her life. The original spruce cabin is long gone, but the stone chamber still rests beneath the Wisconsin soil, a silent, enduring monument to a father's love. It remains a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary innovations are not born from complex, expensive technology, but from the simple, ancient wisdom we forgot we knew. The legacy of Nils Bakke's subterranean bedchamber was felt for generations across the Wisconsin frontier. The rattling cough that had threatened his daughter's life never returned, replaced by the sound of her laughter echoing through a warm, secure home. His quiet determination had turned a community's mockery into a lesson of survival, proving that working with nature's natural laws was more powerful than fighting them with fire. By the time the next winter arrived, 19 other families had dug their own stone-lined sanctuaries under Nils's guidance, ensuring their children would never shiver through another Alberta Clipper. Even Ezra Ward, the proud carpenter who had once declared the pit a grave, spent his remaining years building earth-sheltered spaces for families across the territory. Today, the original log cabin has decayed back into the Wisconsin soil, but the hand-carved stone chamber remains intact, a silent, warm testament to a father's love. It stands as an inspiring reminder that the deepest solutions to our hardest struggles are often waiting right beneath our feet, ready for anyone humble enough to look.